put the pencil back. Okay. All right. So we are back in Genesis. So Genesis 37. Lord willing, we can finish the chapter this evening, and we've met Joseph in some detail. Kind of a young bratty kid who thinks a little bit too much of himself. He is, after all, a teenager. And teenage boys, humility is never their strong suit, right? Joseph seems to be one of those. But now what we want to see, he's had his dreams, so we're going to see him elevate himself only to be humbled by the actions of his brother. So we want to start in verse 12. And we'll go down to verse 17 for now. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to them, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he went from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but a lot of the detail here is unnecessary. Right? And that is not uncommon in the Bible. There's usually a couple of reasons for that. At times it can be for emphasis. For example, when Abraham buys the land, about an acre of land, give or take, in Canaan, he's going to bury his wife in. It's a whole chapter. And I just summarized it in a single sentence. And it doesn't need to be more than that. Abraham bought land of Canaan, to bury his wife. Right? And all the significance of that chapter is still there in that chapter, or in that sentence. Right? The significance is Abraham taking possession of the land. That's the significance in the history of Israel. But it's a long chapter. And it's unnecessarily detailed. And you ask, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is because the writer wants the reader to pause and to consider the significance of what is happening with Abraham. Here, I think we have something similar. There's no special detail here. I'm not going to make a connection to Jesus. I can't do that, right? Broader picture, we can. But I think the significance is to painstakingly slow the narrative down, to build I've had a migraine, so forget the stuttering. I'm losing words. Conflict, that's the word I'm looking for. To build the conflict up more, right? This is a great literary device. If you ever write in a story, try and tell a story, emphasize the boring parts so you can build up to the exciting parts. If you want a modern example of this, you know where I'm going with this, read J.R. Tolkien, particularly The Hobbit. In The Hobbit, what you have is a chapter full of excitement, right? The goblins are going after them in the cave, right? And in the next chapter, they're walking. That's all they're doing, walking. And you're getting the history of Middle Earth. That's all that's happening. It's boring. But as it slows down, it catches the reader off guard. Because you're thinking, oh, well, nothing's going to happen. All of a sudden, they fall through the cave and they're with the goblins, or they so when they're with the elves, very slow. And then all of a sudden, they see rocks fighting each other, mountains fighting each other, something weird like that, right? Tolkien's really good about that in Hobbit. I think that's what we have here. Because think about it. We get a character who serves no purpose in the narrative other than to slow the character down, and the writer doesn't even bother to give us a name, his context, his story, nothing. Joseph is sent to go find his brothers, and he can't find his brothers, and he asks for directions from a dude. You don't need any of those details. What you need is to know Joseph was told to go find his brothers, and he discovered they weren't where they were supposed to be. That's really all the detail you need. But it slows the narrative down, I think on purpose. But nevertheless, the brothers are supposed to be in Shechem as shepherds, right? So we know Shechem is a great place for flocks because there's a lot of green land for them to pasture on, and also an abundance of water. And remember, this is a semi-nomadic people. So So yes, they may have a home base here, but they're going to be all over the place. That would have been common at this time. Shechem is a significant city. It may sound familiar to you. It was the first city of Canaan Abraham visited, Genesis 12:6. If you want to, remember, the covenant is given in verses 1 to 2. In verse 6, he's in Shechem. Okay? Jacob purchased land there and erected an altar to God in Genesis 33, so just a few chapters ago. Later, Joseph will be buried there in Joshua 24. So when his bones are brought back with the Israelites in the Promised Land, he is buried there in Shechem, which is kind of interesting, isn't it? That the story of Joseph really begins in Shechem and it ends in Shechem in many ways. And so the father goes up to the son and says, hey, I need you to go track them down, check in, how are they doing, right? Is everything going okay? And Joseph says, here I am. Now that is common language. You get a lot of literature in the ancient Near Eastern world, and it means, and it indicates one is ready to do what is asked of them. The most famous example of this in the Bible is Isaiah 6. Who shall I send? Who will go for me? Here I am, send me, says Isaiah. But the reader should see this as rather foreboding. Because notice what is happening here. We hinted at this last week, right? Because we saw that Joseph is a shepherd. Joseph is the favorite son. We see these little details that so far have meant something bad's going to happen to this kid. And what is Jacob, the deceiver, asking his son to do? He's asking his favorite son, who receives the blessing of the father, to go into the field where his older brothers are. Like we're getting the hint something bad is going to happen. Just as Abel was favored by God because of his sacrifice, so Joseph is favored by Jacob by virtue of the coat of many colors. And now they're going out into a field. They're going away from home. And so we're starting to think something bad's going to happen. And what happens in the narrative is he says, okay, I'll go find them in Shechem. This is before you have cell phones, right? And you can't track people, which is creepy, but I do it for, son now has a cell phone. First thing we did is, I will track you, right? So if you don't like that, you're not going to have a cell phone, right? You sign the dotted line, you agree to this. Joseph didn't have that. So he comes to Shechem, and they've disappeared. What are the brothers up to? Well, we get that in verse 14. He is traveling 50 miles to find them, and he is searching diligently. They're not there. This unnamed man tells him they're in Dothan, which is an additional mileage away. So he goes 50, and now he has to go even farther. So a 1 mile walk, 2 mile walk is long for the modern American. Try traveling 50 miles without a bus ticket, okay? That's almost airplane territory for some of us, isn't it? So, but again, we have an unnamed man. He serves no purpose in the narrative other than to slow it down. Now, notice the text doesn't tell us why they are in Dothan. We have no idea. They're just not there. They're not in Shechem, they're in Dothan. I don't know what is significant about that town. Now, pause here and ask yourself, why does this story sound familiar? I'm willing to bet that if you were to tell the story of Joseph, you would do the coat of many colors, and you would do, he was thrown into a pit, and you would skip all of this in the middle, wouldn't you? You wouldn't mention Shechem, you wouldn't mention shepherding, you wouldn't mention Dothan. You certainly wouldn't mention the unnamed man. I'd forgotten about this part of the Bible. But it sounds familiar when you just read this part, doesn't it? It should. Because generations later, a descendant of Judah will be the younger brother who is overlooked by his older brothers, who is favored by a prophet, and his father will send him out into the field to check on his brothers. His name is David. So here Joseph is favored by Jacob with the coat of many colors, and he claims for himself kingship. You will bow down before me. And now he is immediately after that sent into the field to ascertain the whereabouts of his brothers. David will be anointed king by Samuel, and then is immediately sent in the next chapter into the field to ascertain the whereabouts of his brothers. It's the same story. Now the difference is Joseph goes into a pit, whereas David has to slay a giant, which elevates him. Joseph goes into exile. David goes into exaltation. However, David's exaltation will eventually lead to his exile. Right? So the David story is delayed. But eventually, the minute Saul at dinner time throws a spear, and it just zings right there, like my brother's mashed potatoes did one time we were in a food fight when mom turned her back on us, right? Just zing right there. David got the hint he wasn't welcome anymore. And for what happens is he goes bit by bit farther away from the promised land until he is outside the land in Moab. Right? And so the story of David mirrors the story of Joseph. That's not an accident. So picking up verse 18 is the action. So we got the slow part. Here's the action. Verse 18, they saw him from afar. Right, they're farming. There you go, Eastern Kentucky, from afar. Is that how you say afar? Afar. And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. He might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. Notice the repetition as a reminder of the significance of the robe. Verse 24, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. So now you can see here's the action, right? They're just doing whatever it is they're doing in Dothan. We never discover what it is, right? They're not where their father told them to be. So you get a hint they're up to no good. And they look out in the distance. There's little Joe. Little Joe's got bad timing. They may already be up to something, and here comes the tattletale, right? He's already tattletaled on them once, right? And so they can't stand the boy. They hate him. They loathe their father because of this, and now is their chance to get him, okay? And they conspire to kill him. The language there, here comes this dreamer, literally means the Lord of Dreams. It's a term of mockery. To give him a high title to show how small he is. Like for example, when I was in school, I seriously considered doing PhD. I actually applied for a D-Min at one point, but I considered doing PhD work. And when asked, one of the reasons I would give is, I only want my wife and her parents to call me doctor, right? Now, the joke about that is I want an elevated title, and in so doing, I'm quite small, right? That's the sort of thing. This is sort of the opposite thing, is the man doesn't have the title, so by giving him the title, they're actually mocking him, right? If you ever study the romance of Martin Luther and Katie von Bora, by the way, we've named our dogs after them. Our beagle was Luther. Our current dog, Australian Shepherd, is named Katie von Bora, Katie. And Katie, when she was really upset at her husband, would call him doctor. Right? It was a sort of a way to put him in his place. Right? You may think you're high and mighty, right? But you ain't nothing, right? But wives have a way of doing that. So they call him the Lord of Dreams, and really reflects their hatred of their brother. And so their plan is given in verse 20. They're going to kill him and then let his body rot in a nearby pit. A rabbit there was chasing, but I won't. Now, we talked about this word pit before. The pit, just to remind you, is a picture of the grave. And Jacob, at the end of the chapter, will associate the pit with the grave. Right? He'll use the term, send me into Sheol. And I showed you then when we did our study of the exaltation theme line of the Bible, the psalmists use this all the time. The pit is the place of the dead. Now, this pit is rather common in ancient Near East, where you'd see them everywhere for various reasons. They serve as grain storage receptacles. They're used for cisterns. This one is a cistern. We know this because the text tells us, verse 24, there's no water in it. It's used for latrines, used for refuse dumps, robber pits, stuff like this. This is also used as a robber pit, isn't it? They actually strip off his costly robe, and then they sell him into slavery. So this pit, so cistern, is used for several things. They were also used to temporarily incarcerate humans. If you want an example of this, Jeremiah 38. Jeremiah is thrown into a pit. He's one of several people in the Bible thrown into pits. Jeremiah, Jesus, or not Jesus, John the Baptist, Daniel, are all thrown into pits. And Joseph is like the first major character that happens to. I guess you could say Jesus was thrown into the pit. It's the tomb, right, which embodies the Joseph story, because it represents death.
Stephen.
Who?
Stephen.
Stephen in the New Testament?
He's stoned.
Oh, stoned. Yeah. That'd be another example. You could almost look at Jonah. Jonah says that he was in Sheol. Now, remember, in the Jewish mindset, the sea is a place of chaos. You've been listening to the Bible Project. The sea and the wilderness, the desert is where chaos is. You want to stay away from them. And so when Jonah goes into the belly of the sea monster, he is going into the grave. Now, it's not a pit, but it is likened to one. All that language is used. So the story of Jonah is a resurrection story. The story of Joseph is a resurrection story, because to his father he is dead. And they would have mourned him as a dead relative, only to discover God has raised him, and as a result has preserved his people. The bodies of murder victims were commonly thrown in pits in the ancient Eastern world. This shows up in the Bible. Absalom was thrown into a pit after he was executed. Remember, his glorious hair, we talked about Sunday morning, got caught in the tree, and he got cut down, thrown into a pit. There he would rot, which is not it's not the same thing as a burial. Remember, that is a very again, I'm losing words. It's a dishonorable way to bury someone in Jewish society. We bury because we inherit our faith in the Jews, right? And so what you do with a body is a reflection of a theology of the body. We still believe this to this day. To this day, we use a lot of stuff to enhance the body of the dead. Right? Why do we do that? It's because of our view of the Imago Dei. And so to let a body rot is very shameful and dishonorable. Jesus would have been given the burial of a slave. He would have been put in a mass grave at best. Instead, he's given an honorable burial. Right? And so Absalom is thrown into a pit. The 70 supporters of a guy named Gedaliah, he's the puppet ruler of Judah, appointed by Babylon. He's murdered and thrown into a royal pit. That's Jeremiah 41. Bet you didn't know that, because I didn't. This pit, because the cistern is probably 10 feet wide and 16 feet deep. You ain't climbing out of that, okay? By the way, Mom and Dad have a well in their backyard. Now, it's an old well, but the problem is they didn't fill it up when we were kids. And you have no idea. If you could go down there, right, it's mostly filled up now. They would put planks and stuff over it. But I bet there's easily 100 baseballs down there. My brother and I, we go out there and play baseball, and I mean, it's sort of like the Sandlot when they ran out of baseballs, so we got Babe Ruth signed one. I mean, that's what it was. We just ran out of baseballs and have to wait till the next holiday to get more baseballs. I bet there's just dozens down there. Now I want you to also notice that this story sounds like Cain and Abel. It is older brothers taking their little brother out into the field at which they conspire to kill him. And it's the language of animals. Remember, you get a serpent in the garden, and when they leave the garden, probably still in the Eden area, what does God say to Cain? Sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. And what do they do here is, we will kill him, and we will make it look like an animal did it. Now, what does that say about the brothers' intent? They've become the animal. Remember, every temptation has to tell you two contradictory lies. You are a god, you are an animal. Much in the same way our society does this with sex. Sex is not that big of a deal. Sex is everything. Have you noticed that? Temptation is the same way. So they don't like that Joseph has been elevated above them, so they think they should be elevated above him. They are gods. And then they respond by acting like animals to bloody the ground. Right? It is the retelling of the Cain and Abel story. Now, Reuben comes. He's clearly the leader. He's the oldest brother, so that is to be expected. He doesn't want to kill him. Now, we're not really told why he intercedes on behalf of his brother. But we can probably surmise a few things. One, Reuben is clearly out of the good grace of his father. You remember what Reuben did? Reuben slept with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. You don't do that in the ancient world. That is claiming to be the patriarch, to be the chief. Remember, Absalom did that with David's concubines. That's basically saying, I am now king. And Absalom did it publicly. I mean, he just took it to a whole nother level. So maybe he's trying to win his father's favor back. We don't know. Now, they strip him of his robe. We've talked about that. That is a symbolic meaning. Remember that Saul rips Samuel's robe, and Samuel takes that and says, as you ripped my robe, so God's going to rip your throne from you. David did that, cut his robe instead of killing him, to say, to remind him, your kingship is being taken away from you. Jesus, of course, was robed with a colored robe only to have it stripped off of him. Right? It's to say, some king you are, your kingdom has been ripped from you. So here's a guy who thinks that he is royal, but now he's been stripped and, if you will, assassinated in the Civil War. And I point this out, verse 23, the repetition, his robe, the robe of many colors. All right, verse 25, we got to move faster. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brothers and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him. He is our brother, our own flesh, and his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. There's a whole lot going on here. Verse 25, they sat down to eat. Kind of callous, isn't it? I think that's on purpose. I wonder if there's a connection to Eden. I don't know. But your brother is there, probably shouting, hey guys, get me out of here. What'd I do wrong? This isn't right. I'm telling daddy, whatever it is. And they're just sitting there eating. I mean, it's just so callous. Now the Ishmaelites come. Now there's their arrival. We've been reading in Genesis, and their arrival is quite interesting, isn't it? Because we know who the Ishmaelites. They're cousins of these boys. So Ishmael is Jacob's uncle, and here they come to turn a son of Jacob, grandson of Isaac, their cousins, into slavery. There's some irony here, and it connects to Ishmael. Remember, Ishmael was the son of an Egyptian woman enslaved by a Hebrew man and oppressed sexually. The story of Joseph is the opposite of that. What you have here is Joseph is the son of a Hebrew man who will be soon the slave of an Egyptian woman who will oppress him sexually. Isn't that fascinating? It's almost like the Bible is written by God. One interesting thing is the Ishmaelites they're traders, right? They're going out of Egypt for trading purposes. They bear gum, balm, and myrrh. Do with this whatever you want. In Genesis 43, those three return. This is what Jacob and his family bring to Egypt as well. Do with that information whatever you want. I don't know if there's any significance to it or not. Just something worth pointing out. Now here, Judah enters into the story. And it's where Judah takes a leadership role. We're going to get an awful story about him soon. Why does he not want to kill Joseph all of a sudden? We can figure out why Reuben maybe, but why Judah? It could be he just wants money. Why let profit go to waste, right? That's very possible. It could be a crisis of conscience. We just don't know. Judah just decides, hey, let's sell him instead of killing him. But verse 27 is interesting. His brothers listened to him. Now, if you're reading Genesis in particular, and you see that phrase, listen to the voice of, or listen to them, the first thing that should come to mind is the Garden of Eden. All right? So Genesis 3:17, remember that God says to Adam, because you will listen to the voice of your wife. Now, what God is not saying, men, never listen to the voice of your wives. There are studies that married men live longer than single men. You want to know why? One of the reasons we think so? Wives insist their husbands go to the doctor. Every married couple is like, oh, yeah, right, that makes sense, right? That makes complete sense. Because men won't. Also, men who are married have greater motivation to do less dumb things. Not that men don't do dumb things, right? They're just less motivated to do the really dumb things. You know, like my dad not too long ago, 70 years old, top of the roof, right? Mom begged him to wait until I came down the house. I finally come down the house to help him out on the roof. Dad goes, I don't need you. I already took care of it, right? I mean, he's home all by himself, by the way, doing this. You know, it's just, I remember Richard Collier, right? I'll never forget. You remember this. He came in, and you know how Richard was. I'm going to go up on the roof, fix it. Now, Richard was not a young spring chicken. And so I'm brand new here. I'm thinking, every sound, I'm going to go up there and check them. I do not like heights. Do not like heights. Mark didn't tell me he was here. Mark goes up there, and when he goes on it, he stumps. All I know is something's happened to him up there. So I'm like, Richard! No answer. I got to climb this thing. So I'm halfway up it, and Mark pulls his head over like the Mighty Python and Search of Holy Grail, the guy on the wall.
What do you see?
You know, like, I thought something happened to Richard. Richard okay? Yeah, why wouldn't he be? It's like, could you make less noise next time? I mean, my goodness. It's just, what were we talking about? Oh, yeah. So his brothers listen to him. So Genesis 3, you see this. Lamech, remember, this is a descendant of Cain, right? He has 2 wives, right? And he tells his wives, listen to the voice of your husband. Sarah does the same thing. Abraham listens to her voice. Same thing, chapter 34. This is where the sons of Judah go in and just slaughter everybody, the Shechemites. And the Shechemites listen to the voice of their king. Later we'll see it in verse 39, chapter 39 rather, with Potiphar's wife, right? Wouldn't listen to the voice. So right away we know something bad is going to happen here. Now, interesting, verse 28, he is sold, is it 20 shekels? Is that what it said? Verse 28, 20 shekels of silver. Here's an interesting thing. When it comes to studying the historicity of the Bible, little details like that are quite helpful. We know what the average cost of a slave was at this time in history, and it matches this. You can look up the Code of Hammurabi, and it sets the price of slaves, and it is 20 shekels of silver. It's almost like this actually happened, right? That we worship a God who shows up in history, and his people tell the story, right? I just find that stuff fascinating. The archaeology of Joseph is interesting. We should know here that slavery was quite common. It still is, by the way. It's very common. Human trafficking is still a major problem in the world. There's many slaves now as there ever has been. Many in the ancient world were a result of war and whatnot, some through trading. The most common group to go into slavery were Asiatics. Now, when I say Asiatics, Asians, what I don't mean are China, Japan, and that sort of stuff. You're really talking about more the Middle East. So if you ever study Jewish history in Egypt around this time, you'll find the phrase Asiatic everywhere. We know there are Asiatics in Avaris, what the Bible calls Goshen. We know that they were shepherds. We know they went through a period of wealth and a period of slavery. We know that there was a mass death of young ones there, and we know that they escaped, right? So we know a lot about the Asiatics that were Semites. In fact, the word Asiatic, there's so many Asiatic slaves, including Semites, is the word Asiatic became synonymous with slave at this time. We do the same thing. The word slave comes from the word Slav. Slavics, or so many Slavics enslaved that the two just became synonymous, right? By the way, when he is sold into slavery, this is the last time Joseph will ever see the promised land. He dies believing it. He never sees it. Almost like a Moses. Interesting, isn't it? All right, verse 29. We really really got to go. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, we don't know why he disappeared all of a sudden, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him." Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, mourned for his sons many days. All of his sons and all of his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. I didn't know this before. On 3 occasions is the ripping of robes. Reuben, Joseph, and Jacob. 3 times you see the ripping of robes. All 3 for different reasons. Right? One is out of fear, that is Reuben. One is out of mourning, that is, of course, Jacob. And the third, of course, is the victim of well, he's an Abel character, and that, of course, is Joseph's robe. Something to keep in your back pocket. But Reuben tears his clothes, and he rightly understands that the supposed death, right, because now he's part of the conspiracy, the supposed death of Joseph is a serious issue. And he hints that he may flee as a result. Remember, he's the oldest, didn't have the best history with his father. It's interesting is he is contemplating fleeing from the Ishmaelites. Or it's like the story of Jacob, isn't it? Jacob had to flee Esau when the deception happened. Remember, Jacob is a deceiver who deceives his brother and father, who then is deceived by his father-in-law, who turns around to deceive his father-in-law, and now the deceiver who deceived all those people is being deceived by his own sons, who those sons deceived their youngest brother. All over, like father, like son. And now Reuben has to make a decision. Do I go in on this deception, or do I realize this how bad this is, that I am going to have to flee like my father had to do with his brother? It's just interesting, little detail there. So they do the trade deal, all that. Verse 32 is interesting. They sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father. Who's the they? It's almost like they put it in a package, right? You know, just sent it off, and I guess they're saying, look, no, I'm just surmising here. No, we didn't meet Joseph. Wow, what's wrong, Dad? I've got his robe. Something's happened to him. You know, they send the robe. It seems to be by someone else. I don't know if that's to create a greater distance, so their father won't assume their brother's involved. I don't know. I never noticed that before. But Jacob is convinced that his son is dead. Verse 33, it is my son's robe. Fierce animal has devoured him. He is without a doubt torn to pieces. In the Hebrew, the verb torn is repeated twice. He has torn his robe. Does your Bible have like surely? He is surely torn. He is without a doubt torn to pieces. Without a doubt. Surely. Yeah, surely. And don't call me Shirley, right? Yeah. So what your English translations are trying to do is to bring out the emphasis. He's surely been torn to pieces. He's without a doubt been torn to pieces. And that's how we do emphasis in English. But in Hebrew, it says, see, now I'm trying to do it. Joseph has been torn to pieces. That's not very good English. Microsoft Word does not like that at all. They'll put the little blue swigglies underneath it. But in Hebrew, that's really good. We've talked about this before. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. Repetition is really important. It was evening, it was morning the first day. It was evening, it was morning the second day. And the Lord saw it and declared it good. And the Lord saw it and declared it good, right? It's very common in the Hebrew Bible. So it isn't just that he's died, but that Jacob is confessing that the robe, by evidence of the robe, Joseph didn't stand a chance. A wild animal has devoured him. This is something Bible Project has been talking about, is that wild animals like this are associated with things like the serpent in the garden, dragons and stuff like that. And so I think we're supposed to pick up on that language. Sin is crouching at the door, and its desires to devour you. And Jacob is convinced such an animal has done that. But we know it's not an actual animal, it's brothers. It's brothers who are doing this, which just makes it far worse. Jacob responds by going into deep grief to the point he is inconsolable. You think Reuben sort of had a hint of this. Like, if we go down this path, you think it's bad now. Dad will go into a deep, deep depression and we'll never get him out of this. I actually think there's something worth exploring the story of Jacob here, of how we handle grief and how not to grieve well. When it comes to grieving is important to do, but what's important is that we grieve well. Jacob is an example of one who doesn't grieve well. In this sense, he's like Naomi in the Ruth story, who changes her name to bitter. Is that Jacob becomes bitter himself to the point that he never is healed of his grief. It's almost as if his idol was taken away from him. And it isn't until he discovers the resurrection of Joseph that he actually finds healing. And how he treats Benjamin and his other sons is worse now, because he never heals. If you don't heal well from grief, the people you love will suffer as a result. Grief robs you of the commandment to love your neighbor. Now, you should grieve, but you need to grieve well. And Jacob is an example of how not to grieve. He acts as if he's lost everything, and yet around him are people who are demonstrating their love for him. Yes, they are evil people. I mean, his sons aren't exactly saints, but they're there with him, and all he sees is his pain, and he doesn't see God's grace all around him. And grief has a way of blinding us to that. Well, verse 36, the story ends on a bit of a happy note, but we don't know that it is a happy note, right? Meanwhile, right, it's like watching Super Friends, right? Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. Oh no. Right? We just read this like, man, this story just getting worse. It's just worse. And of course, we're reminded of the story of Hagar, who was taken from Egypt to be a slave of a Canaanite. Now we have a Canaanite, or an Egyptian, a woman from Egypt to become a slave of an Israelite. An Israelite is taken to be a slave of an Egyptian. And we think, oh no, we know what happened there. Same thing's going to happen to Joseph. And it is what happens to Joseph. But there is a hint. We don't know it yet. There's a hint of good news. Right? So Potiphar is the officer of Pharaoh who serves as the captain of the guard. Right? It's interesting is we met the unnamed guy. We know nothing about him. Here's a guy who won't play a major part of the story. His wife is more significant than Potiphar. But we're given a lot of details about him. In the ancient world, particularly in Rome, but the ancient world, the status of a slave was tied to their master. So if you're in Rome, you would be better off a slave of Caesar than to be a free man in the mines. Because your status as a slave was tied to your master. This is why you read the New Testament. It describes Christians as slaves. Who's your master? It's Jesus. Your status is tied to your master. Well, that would be true here. So he's sold into slavery to a master of sin. That doesn't mean slavery is good or tolerable. Right? The text is clear. This is all bad. Everything about it is bad. What happened to Hagar? Bad. But we're getting a hint of despite exile, there is exaltation. One thing about Egypt is the Egyptians are, according to Genesis 11, 10, 11. Genesis 10. They are descendants of Ham by means of Canaan. You remember that story? You remember after Noah gets off the boat, he builds a vineyard. He has a Garden of Eden. And what happens? He has 3 sons, like Adam and Eve had 3 sons. One of them does something really bad. And that son of his, the son of Ham, Canaan, becomes cursed. And if you follow the genealogy, the Egyptians descend from that cursed son. So the son of Shem, where we get the word Shemites, is now a slave of the Hamites through Canaan, the cursed grandson. So now we're going all the way back to the Tower of Babel, where we have the corruption of the nations. And now, remember that the promise of Abraham is, those who bless you I will bless, those who curse you I will curse. This is the beginning of the Egyptians cursing the Israelites. The Bible opens up in Babylon, Tower of Babel. The Old Testament, it ends in the Old Testament with Babylon. In the middle, Egypt dominates the story. And here is the beginning of that narrative. Potiphar, the name means he who Ra gives. Ra is the sun god. Do with that whatever you want. He is an officer, which usually references a eunuch. Potiphar presumably is not a eunuch. He is married. But it, of course, isn't limited to that of a eunuch. But you would have officers who were made eunuchs for what I assume the obvious reasons. And later, Joseph will meet 2 other officers with the same title. One is the chief cupbearer. The other is the chief baker. They are officers in Pharaoh's court. Here it is, if you want the reference. Pharaoh was angry at his 2 officers. Same word as Potiphar. Now, we don't really know what all that he does. To be the captain of the guard is a generic Hebrew term. It could mean he was a guard of the king, like a bodyguard. Could mean he's a cook. Could mean he just slaughters animals. He could be a butcher. We just don't know. But he is a person of significance, a person who is a chamberlain or an aristocrat of some sort. This is the hint we get that he's a slave, and that's terrible, but there's a hint there's more to this story as the chapter ends. But before we get to that part of the story of Joseph, it's interrupted by Judah. Again, the Bible's really good storytelling. The interruption is to build, I'm losing words. Intensity is not the word I'm looking for. But we want to know what came of Potiphar. Well, you have to wait 2 weeks, right? Because next week, we got to look at Judah and what an awful person he is. Which makes you want to hurry up with Judah. I want to find out what happens with Joseph, right? So really good storytelling. 2 quick points of application. Let's call it a night. 1, jealousy is a poison. Read the book of Genesis. What you get here is a retelling the story of Cain. Jealousy is a poison. And jealousy is a poison, much like its sister envy and bitterness. It is a poison you drink hoping the other person dies. Until you are free of such a poison, you will never find peace, love, or anything. You've got to let that stuff go. Again, read the whole Bible. It's what crucified Jesus in the end. Secondly, the righteous do in fact suffer. Anyone who is surprised that life is difficult despite being a Christian has never read a page of the Bible. The Bible itself wrestles with this. Read the psalmist. Why do the righteous suffer and the wicked seem to prosper? That's a question we have asked forever. And the answer is given through the narrative of the Bible. You have 3 major falls in Genesis 1 through 11. The fall of humanity, the cosmic fall of you got the Nephilim and all that, and then you get the fall of the nations. The war itself is at war with itself. And so we, as exiles, sojourners, are in the middle of that story. Of course we're going to suffer. This isn't our home. And sometimes our story looks like Joseph, that injustice will be done to us, and we will be oppressed. But the story of Joseph shows God is still with Joseph. God is the one who goes into slavery with us. That's the story of the Exodus. God is the one who meets us in the pits. That's the story of Joseph. Now, we've already made all the connections to Jesus. So I trust you've been paying attention, so I won't redo that. But you see Jesus all over here, don't you? The pit narrative, the resurrection narrative, the ripping of the road, and that even when Jesus cries, "Why have you forsaken me?" the point of the story is that God did not forsake his own. That's what the resurrection shows. And through Joseph's suffering, the Israelites are liberated. But one has to go before. All right. Danny, we miss anything? Man, there's a lot in Joseph, isn't it? This is so good. Really, really good. All right. Well, how about this, Danny, since you missed out on Monday and I had to pray. You want to close us out in prayer?
Father, we thank you for this